Language and education, the relationship between schools in the Northwest Arctic and the Inupiat communities they endeavor to serve. There is a powerful connection between language and culture. Language creates communal ties and provides a unique link to cultural heritage. When a culture's language becomes extinct, a significant piece of the culture itself is also lost. Presently, schools in the Northwest Arctic work with local communities to combat the potential extinction of the Inupiaq language by consulting with elders in the community, incorporating Inupiaq into daily school activities, and stressing the importance of language and culture while working with students. Historically, however, schools in Alaska were a means of transmitting the beliefs of Euro-American culture to Alaskan natives. This history must be taken into account when studying the relationship between Northwest Arctic schools and the communities they serve. A better understanding of the past leads to a more comprehensive understanding of the present. In the Northwest Arctic, the Inupiat were punished for decades for speaking Inupiaq, their native language, in academic institutions. This, among other assimilation strategies, played a key role in altering the Inupiat way of life. Despite the good intentions of many staff members throughout the Northwest Arctic Borough School District to respect and embrace the Inupiat culture today, the effects of colonialism, the atrocities of the past, are interwoven into the lives of community members and cannot be ignored. Language is more than a system of communication. Language acts as an intermediate through which cultural views are reflected. According to Witt, language is a community endeavor built up over generations of shared experiences that lead to common understandings of how the world works. In other words, language is a tool passed down from generation to generation that unifies those who use it. When that tool is lost, it is irreplaceable. The collective voices of a culture's ancestors are difficult to reclaim once silenced. When discussing the decline of the Athabascan language and the negative ramifications of losing the language of one's culture, Vice Chairman of the Seelitz tribe, Bud Lane, asserts that when a language becomes extinct, you lose your people's view of the world, and not just of the world today, but you lose your view of how a world came to be for you. Lane explains that the word for earth in Athabascan means made for you, and that his people view their land as a gift from God, made for them to inhabit and to benefit from. He then compares the Athabascan definition to that of other cultures. The meaning is similar, but some of the significance to his people is lost. When a culture's language disappears, a part of that culture's history disappears with it. Kotzebue, Alaska, an Inupiat village in the Northwest Arctic, goes by another name among many of the locals, Qikiqtaguk, which means almost an island. Although inhabited by the Inupiat for thousands of years, it bears the name of the Russian navigator Otto von Kotzebue. With no regard for the first people who used Qikiqtaguk as a meeting place for centuries to trade during summer months, it is common for outsiders to credit Otto von Kotzebue with the discovery of Kotzebue. Published a century ago, Gannett's Geological Survey does just that. The language used by Gannett in identifying the origins of place names ignores the rich experiences and past of the indigenous population. Discounting the language of the Inupiat is analogous to disregarding their history and cultural identity. This is a common strategy for colonizers that makes it easier for the dominant culture to transmit its beliefs. Much has changed in the last century, but the effects of colonialism still weigh heavy on many in the Northwest Arctic. While many in the Northwest Arctic integrate Inupiaq words and phrases into everyday conversation, those who speak the language fluently are rare. According to Eck, the Northwest Arctic region's Inupiaq dialect is listed as an endangered language by the United Nations with fewer than 3,000 speakers. These numbers are disheartening, to say the least, and reflect the negative impact of cultural dominance on the Inupiat people. Many cultural languages are lost when a dominant culture places bans on the use of minority languages or creates educational policies that ignore or exclude local languages. Historically, educational institutions are among the most influential of instruments used to impose Western values and beliefs upon Alaska Natives. To better understand the negative impact educational institutions have had on Inupiat society, a deeper look at the history of education in the Northwest region is beneficial. According to Ang Tuguk, traditional Inupiat society was, and is, about knowing the right time to be in the right place, with the right tools to take advantage of a temporary abundance of resources. Prior to European contact, much of the schooling in the Northwest region involved the transfer of knowledge from elders to youth through observation, apprenticeship, and the immersion of stories and customs centered on hunting, traditional values, and cultural beliefs. Fianna Riordan maintains that education in Alaska was informal and knowledge was passed on generationally. Grandparents, even more than parents, were an important source of moral instruction. Although the transition was gradual, contact with outsiders changed the manner in which knowledge was shared with youth in Alaska Native communities. In the early European contact period, beginning when James Cook sailed into the Chukchi Sea in 1778, the Inupiat educational system was traditional. According to Van Dre, this period was characterized by non-permanence in relations with outsiders and was a period of change, but slow change, characterized by the introduction of outside goods such as metal and guns, but not in sufficient enough quantities to change Inupiat behavior and culture. One of the biggest changes in education for the Northwestern Inupiat coincides with the Organic Act of 1884, which mandated that formal schooling be required for children of all races. 4 years after the Organic Act set a legal precedent for formal education, the Bureau of Indian Affairs became involved in rural Alaska schools. Because the Bureau of Indian Affairs struggled to find teachers, contract schools became common in the early 1890s and led to the missionization of schooling in the region. Religious organizations managed schools and, failing to take moral relativism into account, superimposed their values and beliefs on the Inupiat, believing it was their duty to civilize the savage. School is an agent of socialization, and it is difficult to dispute the role schools have played in assimilating the Inupiat into Western society. The very act of enforcing formal schooling without regard to the lifestyle of the Inupiat illustrates the dominant culture's ethnocentrism and blatant disregard for the customs and beliefs of the indigenous population. Van Dre argues, because the Inupiat were required to go to school and church, they were required to become more sedentary, which had a serious impact on their way of life. The Inupiat were seasonally mobile, but now had to stay in one village year-round. This brought the Inupiat into the disciplinary fold of mainstream American culture and allowed the Inupiat to be assimilated more easily. While mission-run schools did not last long in the grand scheme of things, placing the education of their children in the hands of outsiders made it difficult for Inupiat adults to transmit cultural values to their children. When Alaska became an American state in 1959, the Inupiat, in theory, were to be given representation, a voice in the education of their children. Unfortunately, this was not often the case. Until the Molly Hooch Act of 1976, which pushed for higher education to be made available in rural Alaska, those who wished to ensure their children received a high school diploma were sent to schools away from their native villages, some in southern Alaska, some in other states throughout the country. Those who sought out higher education received generalized education in which they were not allowed to speak their native languages, were not allowed to eat native foods, and were not allowed to contribute to subsistence activities. Students who violated school rules were subjected to corporal punishment. uprooting children from their homes and preventing them from partaking in cultural practices isolated Alaska Native youth from their heritage. As the Inupiat became more and more assimilated into the dominant culture, English became the common language spoken. Conversely, speaking fluent Inupiaq for many became a thing of the past. Considering that much of the foundation of schooling for the indigenous peoples of Alaska is built upon the belief that their cultural worldview is secondary to that of the dominant culture, it is easy to see why parents of Alaska Native children may have reservations and concerns regarding their children's education. Inupiat parents, among others, want to ensure their children are not being taught to look down on their past or to feel inferior because their language and culture are different from those of their teacher. Educators working in Alaska Native communities must be culturally responsive. Anderson Speer maintains that unless educational systems work to completely satisfy their cultural well-being, schools will continue to be the main barrier between the younger generations and their traditional cultures. Regardless of their upbringing or worldview, teachers in Alaska Native villages have a moral obligation to understand and transmit the cultural values of the communities they serve. The Northwest Arctic Borough acknowledges the important role schools must play in the Inupiaq language revitalization plan. Accordingly, it is the policy of the borough to encourage and support the instruction of the Inupiaq language in borough schools under the direction of the school district. Although elders in the Northwest Arctic speak Inupiaq, very few amongst the parent generation and their children speak or understand the language. For this reason, transmitting the Inupiaq language and culture to the youth is of the utmost importance. Currently, hands-on subsistence skills such as harvesting and preserving food, camping, traveling, and outdoor safety are taught in conjunction with exposure to the Inupiaq language as part of their bilingual program. Additionally, the district's Inupiaq Studies program dedicates 30 minutes a day to teaching the Inupiaq language in all elementary schools, with the exception of Deering and Kobuk. Inupiaq Studies is also a requirement for students to graduate high school. The Northwest Arctic Borough School District is taking steps in the right direction to be culturally responsive, but there is still much work to be done. Educational institutions violated the trust of Alaska Natives for decades, and those who endeavor to teach in Alaska Native villages must know that repairing broken trust takes work. Trust is the foundation upon which relationships are built and cannot be established without a mutual respect from all parties involved. Teachers must respect their students' cultural background and work to ensure the content they are teaching relates to the worldview and experiences of their students. This is best accomplished when educators are active in the community and open to learning about traditional practices and philosophies. Trusting educators is more difficult for those recovering from the effects of colonialism, but teachers who dedicate themselves to learning more about the unique cultural heritage and experiences of their students may find the reward is worth the effort. In order to better understand the effects of Euro-American culture on the Inupiat culture, it is beneficial to examine past and present language and educational practices in the Northwest Arctic. This perspective is helpful for educators who wish to teach in Alaska Native villages and may provide a more comprehensive picture of how schools serving Alaska Native communities can best work to support language revitalization projects. Language is a collective tool through which communities shape their perspective of reality. Therefore, language is a central part of group identity and should be respected. Schools, in particular, were used as a means of assimilating the Inupiat. Implementing policies that punish students for their cultural differences may seem cruel, but these policies were common practice in Alaskan schools for decades. Moving forward, schools must be more culturally responsive and committed to working with the community to preserve and strengthen the Inupiaq language, and educators must be open to learning from community members rather than trying to impose their personal views upon them. When people take the time to connect and understand the perspective of others, the groundwork is laid for social change that is equitable and just.